Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Author Series event and World Affairs Today program. For much of the 20th century, the democracies of North Africa and the Middle East were closed systems. In most places, autocrats sacrificed the political liberty of their populations for the security and stability of their states. However, small groups seeking political reform and expression continue to operate, risking persecution, physical violence, and imprisonment. In nearly each of these countries, an Islamist group emerged and operated, despite being outlawed. In December 2010, when a vegetable seller set fire to himself in Tunisia, he inadvertently sparked what became known as the Arab Spring. The systems of repression, which had existed for decades throughout the region, cracked and fell apart. Open, democratic elections were held in some countries, and Islamist parties with their existing networks were able to gain a piece of representative government. Yet how would these groups respond to their involvement in a system which shunned them for so many years? In tonight's program, Dr. Shadi Hamid, author of The Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in the New Middle East, will discuss the changes the Islamist movement has made over time, adapting to the political climate of their countries. Dr. Hamid draws on hundreds of interviews with leaders and activists to further our understanding of the Islamist movement. Dr. Shadi Hamid is a fellow at the Project on U.S. Islamic World Relations at the Brookings Institution's Saban Center for Middle East Policy. Previously, he was Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University's Center on Development and the Rule of Law. He serves as Vice Chair of the Project on Middle East Democracy and is a regular contributor to The Atlantic and many other publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shadi Hamid.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the World Affairs Council of D.C. for having me. And thanks to all of you for coming on such a beautiful day. You chose to discuss Islamist parties rather than enjoying the very nice weather, so I appreciate that. I personally think this is the more interesting thing to do on your Monday night. So let me just kind of start by giving you some context. This book was really 10 years in the making. I started conducting field research in Jordan in 2004, 2005, and really ever since then I've been absolutely hooked and fascinated by Islamist movements. And what I really tried to do in my time there and after that was really immerse myself in their world, to really understand what animates them, what drives these movements. And I really take seriously the notion that to understand Islamist groups, you actually have to get to know them. You have to spend time with them, sit with them, talk to them, and understand them as real people. And I think, unfortunately, we see a lot of commentary on Islamist movements from people who don't necessarily know Islamists, real live Islamists personally. And I remember when I started off in this area, so I was, I think, the only Western researcher living in Jordan at that time focusing on this particular issue. And I was a young grad student at the time. I would go to the Muslim Brotherhood's archives and just day in and day out, read documents, articles. And it was funny because they didn't really quite know what to make of me. They would see me come in and they'd be a little bit suspicious. Why does this American researcher care about us so much? And that was at a time when Islamist movements, it wasn't the hot thing. It was interesting, but it was still pre-Arab Spring, and especially to focus on Jordanian Islamists who traditionally haven't gotten that much attention. So they were a bit suspicious, and there's always a thing, you know, oh, is he a spy? Who's paying him? U.S. government, whatever, and all of that. So I was able since then, so from 2004, 2005 until really today, to track the evolution of Islamist groups. And I focus quite a bit on Egypt and Jordan, but also on Tunisia post-Arab Spring. And I was able to kind of look at how different Muslim Brotherhood leaders changed over time in terms of what they would say to me, in terms of their priorities and what they were really focusing on. And I'll just kind of start with a very interesting example from someone all of you know, ex-President Mohamed Morsi of Egypt. And I got to know him a little bit before he became president. And I remember the first time I met with him was on May 8th, 2010. And Morsi is an interesting character, not to go too much into what he's like as a person, but, you know, he was at that time someone who you would never dream would become the president of Egypt. And it's just kind of interesting to look back in retrospect. And he's the kind of guy who would make kind of off-color jokes. I remember once he did an impression of a former American president, and Jimmy Carter actually, and he would name check you know, movies from the 70s because he lived in the U.S. in the in the late 70s, early 80s when he was doing his PhD. So he's an interesting character, but again, someone who you wouldn't have dreamed would rise to this role and really become one of the central figures in the post-Arab Spring Arab world. Now, he said something very interesting to me in that first meeting, and I'll just quote that. I was describing the Muslim Brotherhood as an opposition group, and he didn't like the word opposition. This is what he said. The word opposition has the connotation of seeking power, but at this moment we are not seeking power because that requires preparation, and society is not prepared. And keep in mind, this was really 7 months before the Arab Spring broke out. The prospect of power seemed so remote. It wasn't even something they were thinking about. And just a number of months later, we see Mubarak's fall and we see the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt thrust into this unprecedented position that they weren't actually ready for. But what we see, and what I saw in my many discussions with Islamist leaders pre-Arab Spring, was this ambivalence about power. They realized that power was a dangerous thing. And similarly, there's a famous quote from Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of the Nahda party in Tunisia, and he said this when he was in exile in Britain many years ago. He said, the most dangerous thing is for Islamists to be loved by the people before they come to power and hated afterwards. And fast forwarding a little bit, even after the Arab Spring, I met with Assam al-Arian, a Muslim Brotherhood leader. It was May 2011, so a couple months after Mubarak fell. And he actually, I didn't even realize that he said this until I was looking back at my notes and my recordings when I was finishing up the book. And I was amazed to find this. We had this conversation and he said, quote unquote, and I cite this in the book, the people won't accept an Islamist president. He said that in May 2011, and I suppose he was right. Now, this is why I chose, when we were debating what kind of title we wanted for this book, I wanted to go for Temptations of Power. Because I thought this really captured, you know, this shift from opposition to power that Islamists said. They insisted that they knew better, that power was dangerous, that they had to be careful, gradual, cautious. But even so, they succumbed to the temptations of power. They did succumb. And, you know, this is obvious, you know, this is a kind of universal sentiment that I'm sure we can all relate to. When you know that you shouldn't do something, you're doing it, and you'll probably regret it after you do it. I'm not sure if Islamists are quite at this stage where they're really regretting it now. They still defend their decision to run a candidate for president, but I think you're starting to see, you know, was this the right thing? Did we move too quickly? Now, this tension between being in opposition and being in power also really came to the fore when I was in Egypt not too long ago in August this past August, and I was there in Egypt a few days before the Rabaa massacre of August 14th, what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So I was at the Rabaa sit-in meeting with Brotherhood officials, and Assam Larian, again, I met with him. And what was interesting about this was right after the military coup. The Brotherhood was in a very difficult position, but Assam Larian looked more calm and comfortable than I ever remember seeing him. And he was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. He just kind of came out and he met me in the middle of Rabaa. And I was surprised. Why is he so calm and comfortable? And similarly, Jihad al-Haddad, another Muslim Brotherhood official, around that same time, he told me that he felt very much at peace. And this was interesting because almost in a sense, the Brotherhood was returning to its natural state. It felt more comfortable in opposition, that the 1 year in power under Morsi was an aberration. They didn't feel really comfortable, but now they were back in the pure state of opposition. Now, granted, this was before the massacre happened. They weren't looking very calm and comfortable after that happened, obviously. But even at that time, right on the eve of that terrible day in Egypt's history, you see this kind of sense that we're back where we belong, fighting this fight that we've been fighting for really 8 decades. Now, this is, I think, I talk in the book about these two distinctive phases, and I want to talk about the key arguments that I make here. So, one of the arguments I make is that contrary to the academic and conventional wisdom, repression, rather than having a radicalizing effect on Islamist groups, forced them to become more moderate pre-Arab Spring. So if we look at this pre-Arab Spring period, this period of repression, that's one of the arguments I make. And this is somewhat, it was somewhat counterintuitive in my research to come to this conclusion. I don't want to say that repression always produces moderation, but in these particular circumstances, we do see that as repression is intensifying under the Mubarak regime in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood there is becoming more moderate. And I look at several indicators. So for example, they're de-emphasizing Sharia law. They're embracing many of the tenets of democratic life, including alternation of power, popular sovereignty. They're reaching out to liberal and leftist groups like never before, and they're democratizing their internal organizational structures. So why would repression force Islamist moderation? And I call this a kind of forced moderation. And I discuss this at length in chapter 2, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but very briefly, I'll just mention a couple of the causal mechanisms or the causal factors that lead to this unexpected outcome. So first of all, and it's somewhat intuitive, that you realize how important democracy is when you've been deprived of it. So they were experiencing more and more repression, and then banning alcohol or segregating the sexes doesn't seem very important when the secret police can come unannounced at your door in the middle of the night and put you in prison. So it has a way of concentrating the mind. And there's other transitions where we see something similar, that the experience of repression makes opposition groups realize just how fundamental, just how necessary having at least a margin of freedom is. So that's the intuitive part. But also, Islamists realized that they were more vulnerable to repression when they were alone. They didn't want to face it alone. So they had to reach out to liberal and leftist groups so they could kind of have a buffer against regime repression. So it wasn't only just them facing this head on. And the way that you build these coalitions with non-Islamist groups is by emphasizing the more moderate aspects of your message, whether it's on women's rights, protection of minority rights, emphasizing pluralism and democracy. So they felt they had to do this in order to build a broader base of support. Another factor, the Islamist base understands that in periods of repression, Islamic law is not the priority. They understand that survival takes precedence over all else, so they're willing to give their leadership a certain degree of latitude. So they can kind of, in a sense, postpone these ideological issues and put them to the side. And lastly, while they were being repressed, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan wanted to reach out to Western audiences because the U.S. was and continues to be the primary military patron of Egypt and Jordan. So they saw the importance of reaching out to Western audiences and policymakers and saying to the world, listen, we don't deserve to be repressed because we're actually somewhat moderate. We've evolved over time, and look, this is how we've evolved. So they were very intent on conveying that message as well. Now, the flip side of repression and moderation is what happens when you have democratic openings. Now, the conventional wisdom there, and also drawing on the academic literature, is this idea that the more you include Islamists in the political process, in the democratic process, the more moderate they'll become. It makes sense intuitively. So more democracy means more moderation. That's what we've thought for a long time. And again, I wanted to problematize this notion because I found something a little bit different. And this idea that good things go together, that democratization leads to Islamist moderation, it's become so much part of our public discourse. And actually, even our former president, George W. Bush, popularized this notion in 2005. And it's actually a really interesting quote. And again, this is something that I found quite interesting in retrospect. So this is George W. Bush. In 2005, he was responding to a question about Hezbollah's participation in Lebanese politics. This is what he had to say, quote unquote. I like the idea of people running for office. There's a positive effect. Maybe some will run for office and say, vote for me. I look forward to blowing up America, but I don't think so. I think people who generally run for office say, vote for me, I'm looking to fix your potholes. Also known as the pothole theory of democracy, George W. Bush's contribution to public discourse. So this is actually, again, this is something that you would think, it makes sense, but that's not quite what I found in my research. And this is where the second part of this argument comes in, that I actually argue that democratization can actually push Islamist groups further to the right. So instead of moderating them, we see a push rightwards. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, and very quickly I'll mention this. Mention some of the reasons and factors behind this. First of all, we're talking about, and I think this is actually a process that we saw during Morsi's 1 year in power. Now, he didn't make Egypt into a theocracy, by no means, but we do see a steady shift to the right. We do see a deepening of Islamist rhetoric. We do see reaching out to Salafi groups. So again, this is counterintuitive in a way, because I think as Americans, we think that, once you bring people into the process, then you're going to see them move to the center. And this is something that those of you who've studied political scientists are probably familiar with, that when you have ideological parties on the right or left, if they want to win elections, they have to move to the center because that's where independent voters are. That's how you build broad-based coalitions. But what we see in the Arab world, I would argue, is something a little bit different for a number of reasons. Now, number one, these are deeply conservative societies. So if there is a popular demand for the implementation of Sharia law, then someone has to supply it. Islamist groups have to supply it. And nearly all the polling we have, particularly in a country like Egypt, but also to different degrees in other countries, we see widespread popular support for the role of Sharia law in public and political life. And I can give you a number of examples, some of them more striking than others, but here are a couple of them. There was a 2011 Pew poll where 80% of Egyptian respondents said they supported the stoning of adulterers, 70% said they supported the cutting off of the hands of thieves, and 88% said they supported the death penalty for apostasy, i.e. leaving Islam. Now, this could be an outlier, but even if you cut it by like 20 or 30%, it's still a fairly large part of the population. Now, Muslims would say there's a lot of preconditions that have to be implemented before you institute these kinds of harsh punishments, but I think the point remains that there is surprisingly widespread support for these types of punishments. Now, putting that to the side, here are some other examples. In Jordan, in the 2010 Arab Barometer, 62% of Jordanians said they would support, quote unquote, a system governed by Islamic law in which there are no parties or elections. So that's a pretty strong sentiment there. The list goes on. A March 2012 YouGov poll where Egyptians said that only 18% of Egyptians said they would support a female president, a female head of state. A 2011 Gallup poll where 69% of Egyptians said that, quote unquote, religious leaders should advise those in authority with writing national legislation. 70% supported a role for clerics effectively in that. So the point here though is you move to the center when that's where most of your population is. Makes sense. But what if you have a large part of your population which is not in the center, at least on a particular set of issues, and is somewhat to the right? So that's one factor here. Another is you have your conservative base. So forget about popular sentiment. You really have to take care of your conservative base because they were giving the leadership a lot of latitude under repression. But now with the democratic opening, they want to see their leaders reflecting Islamic law in public life. That's why many of them voted for Islamist parties, because they want to see that. And this leads to what I call a Tea Party effect, where not only is your conservative base putting pressure on you, but you see the proliferation of right-wing Islamist groups, so ultra-conservative Salafis, for example, who are dragging groups like the Muslim Brotherhood further rightward. And I call the Tea Party effect because even in an established democracy like ours, we do see this kind of dynamic where, or even in Europe, with parties like the CDU in Germany, which are engaging in a lot of inflammatory anti-immigration rhetoric because the far-right groups are putting pressure on them. So the Muslim Brotherhood and groups like that no longer have a monopoly on the Islamist vote. So you see a kind of religious outbidding, and you see different groups competing for this particular constituency in society. Also connected to this is the idea that in deeply polarized societies, you have a weak center. Most people, you have a lot of polarization, so political parties ask themselves, what's the point of moving to the center? What's the point of trying to convince secular voters to vote for me when they're probably not going to change their mind because attitudes are very entrenched along ideological lines? And I think we saw some of that in Turkey recently with the March 30th elections. Instead of Erdogan and the AK party moving to the center, what they did was double down on their conservative base, rallying their base, and they actually were able to increase their vote from 39% to 45% in local elections. Now, this leads to the subtitle of my book, Illiberal Democracy. So if Islamist groups in democratic settings are moving further to the right, that doesn't mean they're giving up on democracy. I would actually argue that they are committed to the democratic process, but they are using, let's say, the democratic process to pursue illiberal ends. And this leads to a kind of conundrum or a kind of thorny question, especially for us as Americans. Do Arabs have the right to decide through the democratic process that they don't want to be liberal? And it's not just reflecting that sentiment in the parliamentary process, but also in constitutions. So you might say, well, a constitution should have this strong liberal secular framework. Fair enough. But then Islamists would say, well, shouldn't a constitution reflect the cultural reality of society? If a large majority of Egyptians want Islam to play a more prominent role, shouldn't that be in the constitution? Again, it's an open question, and people can differ on their response. Now, you saw the tensions, these kind of ideological tensions, manifest themselves during Morsi's constitutional drafting process. And that constitution was very controversial. And I just want to use this as an example to get to a bigger point about the nature of ideological divides in these societies. So the Brotherhood was kind of sandwiched in the middle. They had liberals on their left flank and Salafis on the right flank. And Salafis wanted stronger language on Sharia in the Constitution. But the Brotherhood resisted that specific demand, and they came up with a compromise article in the Constitution, Article 219, which they hoped would satisfy Salafis, but also not be too controversial with liberals. And essentially that defined Sharia in a somewhat restrictive way, and that actually ended up alienating liberals, and this was one of the lightning rods in the Constitution drafting process. Now, Morsi should have done much more to emphasize consensus during this Constitution drafting process, but I would pose the question, is consensus possible when you have two irreconcilable notions or conceptions of the good? Salafis have a particular conception of the good. Liberals have their own particular conception. Can those two be reconciled? Because liberals, by definition, believe that certain freedoms and civil liberties and personal rights are non-negotiable, right? Salafis believe in something quite different, that the state should have the right or the jurisdiction to interfere in the private lives of citizens or to promote a particular conception of religion. How do you square the circle there? Is it possible to square the circle? And liberals would say that their solution is the appropriate one, that they have the compromise solution, because in a liberal society, everyone, they would say, can express their personal views on religion openly, just as we do here in the US, right? But Islamists would say that they cannot fully express their Islamism under a liberal framework. So again, we reach this kind of impasse. Now, a lot of people will say that liberalism is neutral, but the notion that liberalism is neutral can only be accepted within a liberal framework. If you're not starting from that starting point, then you're not going to agree that liberalism is neutral. Now, let's talk briefly about what are some efforts to resolve this fundamental ideological impasse. Is it possible? Let's look at Tunisia, and I have a chapter in the book, A Tunisian Exception, question mark. And again, I mean, it's still an open question. We don't have a definitive answer. But I think what's interesting there, and what I would argue, is that Tunisia is not yet an example of reconciling Islamism and democracy. First of all, Islamists are no longer in power. They voluntarily stepped down from power under pressure from the secular opposition. But what I think is more interesting in this regard is that they made one compromise after another. So they withdrew any Sharia-specific language. There were three, Islamist clauses in the Constitution in earlier drafts that they withdrew, and in the face of secular opposition. But even with the compromises that they were willing to make, you still saw this staunch secular opposition. And you saw over the summer mass protests threatening to bring the government down, dissolving the Constituent Assembly unless Ennahda voluntarily stepped down from power. They did do that. But it raises the question, it still raises the question of what happens if Ennahda wins the next election and it keeps on winning elections and it feels it has to be more responsive to its conservative base? Is the secular opposition going to accept Islamists in power for a sustained period of time? Because even with all the compromises Ennahda was willing to make, and Ennahda is pretty much the most moderate Islamist party you can find, so it's troubling that you still have this degree of ideological conflict, even in a context where an Islamist party is trying to reach out to secular groups and trying to make fundamental concessions. But I would say that even with a moderate group like Ennahda, they are Islamists for a reason. And I think this is where we get to the fundamental ideological divide. Islamists are Islamists for a reason. They do have a distinctive worldview. They do believe in things that liberals and secularists don't believe. And what I tried to do in this book, I wanted to bring back ideas and ideology into the discussion. So it's not just that Islamists are moving to the right because of electoral imperatives. They're moving to the right because of things that they feel, of things that they believe. And I think we have to see these Islamist commitments as something that's honestly and deeply felt by individual Islamists. They really do believe. They might not know the specifics of how to implement Sharia law, but generally speaking, they do have a particular conception of society where Islam and Islamic law do play a more prominent role. Now, I think the nature of the gap is somewhat unique in the Arab world because you have other places where there are illiberal Democrats. Illiberal democracy is not something that's unique to the Arab world. Fareed Zakaria popularized this notion in his book, The Future of Freedom, and he talked about many non-Arab and non-Muslim societies. So Hugo Chavez, for example, in Venezuela. But Hugo Chavez's illiberalism was not central to his ideology, where I would argue that a certain degree of illiberalism is inherent in Islamist ideology. And again, this makes it more complicated to resolve. Now, how can we resolve it? And I'll just end with a couple different options going forward. One option is the repression option, which is what we see being exercised in Egypt, that there is no place for Islamist groups in a secular state system. And I would use secular in quotation marks because they're not truly secular state systems. But we do have an existing state system in the Middle East, and it hasn't been able to accommodate Islamist parties. And we see no real models or examples where Islamist parties have been accommodated for a sustained period of time. Perhaps Turkey, but Turkey isn't quite there because they aren't Islamists in the sense that the Muslim Brotherhood are Islamists in Egypt. They don't even call themselves Islamists anymore. So we have to kind of be careful about the Turkish model. So we have this repressive route, and it's really driven by this illusion that Islamists can be destroyed, that the Muslim Brotherhood can be permanently eliminated. And I would say that that is an illusion. It's not actually possible, and time again over the last 6 decades, these efforts have failed. It's one thing to kill an organization. It's altogether another thing to kill an idea. And groups like the Muslim Brotherhood represent ideas that are deeply held by a large segment of the population in many of these countries. The other option, and perhaps the one that I would lean towards, is we have to accept some degree of illiberal democracy if democracy is going to have any hope in the Middle East. You open up these systems, you have a process of democratization. Islamists inevitably are going to do well. Doesn't mean they're going to win a majority, but they're going to have a major role in these societies, and you're going to see an Islamization of public discourse. You're going to see a rightward shift. And I think that to some degree is inevitable. Now, there's a third alternative, which is what we see in Tunisia and what we see to some extent in Turkey, where Islamists become incorporated into the political process, but only if they give up their Islamism. So effectively what we see in Tunisia, Ennahda gives up their Islamism in the constitution drafting process. They put that to the side. Or the Turks, the Turkish Islamists who are now neo-Islamists or conservative Democrats, they become part of Turkey's secular state system, but they have to give up their Islamism in order to be fully accepted. Now, this could be a third alternative, but I would ask, is it sustainable to ask Islamists to give up their Islamism indefinitely, permanently? They can maybe do that for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but even now in Turkey, you see Turkey's neo-Islamists pushing against the boundaries of the Turkish secular state system. They're trying to erode those constraints that have been there for decades. Now, I'll just end here and say, I'm personally a liberal in the American context. I would prefer to live under a liberal secular framework. But I don't really think it's my job as an American to tell Egyptians or Tunisians what the right solution is, to say that liberalism is preferable, because I'm also a small d Democrat. And part of being a small d Democrat is accepting that different societies will go their own way. But again, that raises the question, do Arabs, do Egyptians, or whoever, do they have the right to try out an alternative ideological project? Or is liberal democracy the final endpoint of human civilization, as Francis Fukuyama wrote in his classic article? This is it. You can't be beyond that. You can't go outside of that. But I think what we're seeing now is there are societies that may want to try out a different kind of alternative, one that we as Americans may not fully be comfortable with, and really brings to the fore these very real tensions between liberalism on one hand and democracy on the other. Good things don't always go together, and I think particularly in the Arab world, there is a real tension there. So I'll end with that and look forward to the discussion with all of you. Thank you.
This could be outside your scope of interest, but given your research, given your interviews, do you think Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, can govern Egypt effectively? I think there's one way to look at this organization is it's a terrorist organization. I'm not of that perspective, but some people do see it that way. Another way to look at them is to say that this is the most successful non-governmental organization in the history of the Arab world. It's provided for the poor. It has hospitals, healthcare, education, etc. Can it translate that type of effective provision for the people of Egypt if it is given another chance to be in power in the country? Because I think that's what democracy is all about, putting into power people that can lead the country. So I want to ask you, do you think they have that capability as an organization?
Well, I mean, first of all, we don't know. I mean, we have the 1 year that we can kind of base our conclusions on, but no matter who came to power, they weren't going to be able to manage Egypt's problems. So I think 1 year was a very unrealistic time span to really think that anyone would be able to make major reforms one way or the other. So I think to some extent, whether it was a liberal president or leftist, whatever, you were going to see this popular discontent because it's very difficult to fix Egypt's potholes. So that's one. But the Brotherhood did have a history of being quite successful, as you point out, in social service provision on the local level, building ties with grassroots supporters and all of that. They weren't able to translate that effectively when they were in government. But again, government is something you learn by doing, and I think it would have been quite interesting to see how the Brotherhood would have evolved if Morsi had more time in power. Now, I don't think it particularly matters from a small d democratic standpoint whether the Brotherhood is good at governing or not. I don't particularly care. There's no such thing as performance legitimacy. You don't lose your legitimacy as a democratically elected leader if you mess up the economy. If you did, then every single government in the world that was democratically elected would be, pushed out by a military coup or mass protest, because oftentimes elected governments mismanage the economy. That's why you have a self-correcting mechanism where people can decide to vote for someone else if the party in power doesn't manage the economy well. So this argument that Morsi had lost his legitimacy because he had woefully mismanaged the economy, for me, that's a total red herring. It's irrelevant. That has no bearing on whether or not someone should be in power. We believe as small d Democrats in democratic legitimacy. Now, so that's what I would say on that. Now, obviously, many Egyptians disagreed with that, and they felt that they had justification to go out and support a military coup for a variety of reasons. One of them was Morsi mismanaging the economy, but also, I think, because of these fundamental ideological divides that I was talking about. And I'll just say one word on that, because this is the part that I think is very difficult to address. In Latin America, in those transitions, Chile, Argentina, whatever it might be, the opposition was able to reassure elites and saying that your material interests will be protected if there's a transition. The fundamental divide was at least somewhat economic in nature, so it was tangible. You can have a discussion about economics because it's real. You can, in a sense, you can touch it, numbers, money, so on and so forth. What's difficult about the ideological divide in the Arab world is that it's almost metaphysical in a way. It's about the very nature of the state. It's about the identity of Egypt. It's about personal freedoms, which again are something very raw and existential for a lot of people. They weren't so much, they didn't like Morsi and what he did in his 1 year in power, but it was even more than that, a fear of what he might do in power if he stayed in power. So it was a fear about the future. And that's very difficult to address because we don't know what the future is. It's hard to argue about something that hasn't actually happened yet. But that fear was very much in the minds of liberals and secularists, saying that if they have 10 years in power, you're going to see Egypt totally altered as a state. Now, how do you address that? How do you split the middle on ideology, on religion, on things that are so deeply felt? It's difficult.
I'm a historical sociologist and a religious historian. I've been working in this field for 30 years, and I have written books on the subject. And one thing I discovered years ago is that there is a thread through all conservative kind of religions, American Dominionist, Pat Roberts, all who call for the government to be controlled by religion, or through the Catholic Church where you had Christendom, conservative Catholicism, well into Buddhism, and well into Islam. And that one common denominator with religions who seek to be political is women. And it appears to me, and I have firmly decided now, thanks to your little talk tonight, eliminating other things, that the L in liberal, you can mask it in Sharia law or anything you want. The L in liberal is the ladies. And I believe what you have here is a reaction to the gradual feminization of the world, the freedom of women all across the world, and you've got nothing more than a bunch of guys that want to stay in power to control that. And that is the bottom line of conservative religion.
I will agree with you to a degree, but I wouldn't want to reduce it to just the issue of women's rights. That's a very sensitive issue for Islamists as well as other Christian conservatives, so on and so forth. I think you're right to say that this is one of the common defining threads that we see in conservative religion. But I would also say that even if you go outside the Islamist spectrum, it's not as if the Brotherhood is advocating ideas on women that are very much out of place in their society. And I cited that poll where only 18% of Egyptians believe that there should be a female head of state. Even if you break it down by gender, only 24% of Egyptian women believe that a fellow woman should be head of state. So it goes well beyond men or Islamists, and we're talking about broadly held conservative attitudes. But even more than that, I mean, we kind of hypothesize what an Islamist government would do in power. Women's rights is part of it, but I think there's also a lot of other things that go well beyond that. When it comes to family law, which also touches on women, obviously, family law, punishments, alcohol consumption, segregation, but also more generally, using the state apparatus to promote a particular conception of religion. So it doesn't even have to be imposed. And Islamism isn't always about imposing things. It's about using the soft power of the state machinery to promote a particular conception of religion in public life. So unlike liberals, they do not believe that the state should be ideologically or religiously neutral. They believe the state has a role to play in inculcating certain values in the younger generation, for example. So we can talk about banks and interest. Islamic banking, would interest be banned, or however you define interest? So you see a lot of ways that Islamists might reflect their Islamism in public life.
Historically, has there ever been a state run by true believers, whether religious true believers or some other ideological true believers, which has allowed an effective opposition that might possibly threaten its control of power? I don't think so.
Well, it depends what you mean by true believers, but if we're talking about ideological parties, there has certainly been a lot of ideological parties that have come to power that have accepted alternation of power, that when they lose elections, they give up power. Christian Democrats, socialists, communists for that matter. We have the case of Hindu nationalists, and we'll see that play out in India now. We see Turkey, where, yes, Erdogan is a liberal. He has some authoritarian tendencies, but he hasn't ended the democratic process. There still are free and fair elections, and there's nothing to suggest that Erdogan will undo that. There's never been a case of one person, one vote, one time. No historical instance. That's always what you hear people say about Islamists. One person, one vote, one time, meaning that they will come to power through democratic elections, then they will end democracy as we know it. This has never actually happened. It's a speculative fear. People could argue that it could happen in the future, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, I think a lot of Republicans are true believers. Do I think that they're going to undo the democratic process? No, partly because there are strong institutions, there's a strong framework in place, and that's one thing that we can kind of talk about. How do you kind of blunt the ideological thrust of these groups? One way to do it is through strong institutions, through a certain kind of electoral process that encourages proportional representation and allows a broad array of actors to be part of the political process. There's a lot of ways to do that institutionally to encourage power sharing, for example. But ultimately, if you come to the conclusion that true believers, in this case Islamists, cannot be trusted in the democratic process, then what do? Then you could, I suppose, ban them, try to push them outside of the democratic process, but is that sustainable? If these are parties that represent 20 or 30% of their societies, can you actually keep them out of the political process for decades? I would argue that you can't. It's not realistic. I would also say, from a small d democratic standpoint, it's also immoral. It's not normatively right to deny a segment of the population from representation in the political process. Does that answer your question?
No.
Well, can you maybe elaborate, and I'll try to...
My observation has been that when you have a group of people in power who have a political base, not just, I'm not talking about an elite taking over, but people with a serious political base, who represent an ideological worldview of which religion is clearly a prominent one. We can all say the Islamists fit in this category, but that doesn't mean everyone who's Islamic fits in this category. It's not quite the same.
Sure.
Not quite the same thing. That they are so convinced that that they are the people of God, even when they don't believe in God, that they are simply not going to allow a serious threat to losing power. And I have, while I appreciate your calling our current Republican Party true believers, they're not quite in the category I meant by true believers.
I would actually, fair point. I would actually argue that Islamists are more in the mainstream of their country's politics than Republicans are in the broad mainstream of American politics.
And I wouldn't disagree with you on that, because they have a bigger social base than our Republican Party does.
So it's a valid point, and this is, I think, why some people... there is, I think, a broader question of, are there kind of secular prerequisites? Do you have to adapt your conception of religion to be a full participant in democratic politics? I mean, there's a lot of debates, obviously, in the academic literature about prerequisites to democracy. Now, I would say that the Brotherhood, and I tracked this process over time, did become more moderate in the sense that they accepted popular sovereignty as a fundamental idea instead of holding on to divine sovereignty. If we talked about Islamists in the 60s or 70s, there was still very much this idea that laws came straight from God, the democratic process was problematic, democracy was a foreign import. Over time, they made peace with the democracy and also the idea of pluralism, that liberals and leftists could be active participants in public life, And also, now we can kind of ask whether or not they're being sincere, and this is always the difficulty when talking about ideological groups. But Islamists did say time and time again in various declarative statements, position papers, in the cases that I look at in the book, that they do not have a monopoly on the truth, that other people can represent God's will, so on and so forth. Now, there will always be some people who will not believe them regardless of what they say, and I think that's why it's very difficult to resolve these issues in the region, because many liberals would say precisely that Islamists are wolves in sheep's clothing, that they're waiting for the time to strike, and if you give them enough rope, they're going to, move in a particular direction which is destructive towards democracy. Now, the fact that it's never happened in quite that way, I think that would lead me to say that we should be cautious about those claims, because there is no evidence that those claims will be reflected in actual reality going forward. Now, if we had a sample size where Islamists did destroy democracy after rising to power through the democratic process, then I think there would be a much stronger leg to argue on there.
Islam is more or less 1,400 years old. How old are you suggesting political Islam is? Egypt, and then other than Egypt?
Sure. Well, political Islam as we understand it today is a modern phenomenon. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 in Egypt. But if we think about political Islam more broadly as the intertwining of religion and politics, then that's something that we can kind of go 1,400 years back on, where, Prophet Muhammad was not just a cleric or a theologian or a prophet, but he was also a politician. And you see the two very much intertwined, reflected in his authority. Now, if you look at the subsequent centuries of Islamic rule, we can talk about different manifestations of religion and politics, but generally, Islam was never privatized. Islam and Islamic law was very much part of political life. It was part of the legal system. That has been consistent really through 14 centuries, with brief, I would say, interludes or aberrations, if you will, during the kind of secular modernizing period. And there have been efforts in the Middle East to privatize religion, and I would argue that people can try, but it's failed. Turkey, a very aggressive, repressive, sometimes brutal effort to put Islam in the private sphere and keep it there.
Since the Ottomans?
Yeah, so Ataturk in the 1920s, and really the Turkish secular system has really tried to keep Islamism at bay. In Tunisia, we see something similar. Again, a very kind of aggressive, forced secularization. But again, it didn't really work. It wasn't sustainable over a longer period of time. And that raises, I think, a very interesting, thorny question. Another one, is there something unique about Islam that makes it more immune to secularization or privatization? Again, I'll pose it as an open question. That's not really the subject of my book or my talk, but I think it is an interesting thing to think about more. But I would say that Islam is distinctive in the sense that it's more difficult to separate politics. In Christianity, you do have a tradition of leave unto Caesar what is his. It's much more difficult to make that case in the Islamic context. And I think, and I would just kind of expand on that a little bit, and a lot of people will say, well, the Muslim world has to go through its own enlightenment, that it has to go through its own reformation. Is a reformation possible in the Muslim world the way it happened in Europe? I mean, how closely do we tie Enlightenment ideals with modern democracy, with modern liberal democracy? And again, I would kind of problematize the notion that all religions go through this kind of fundamental reformation process where religion is relegated to the private sphere, or it becomes less important in politics. That may not happen in the Middle Eastern context.
Do you think maybe in the future we would be able to see a government in Egypt where secular, non-religious and maybe the Islamist leaders will work together in the government, or do you think there's going to be like a constant fight between the secular part of the government and the more religious Islamist part of it?
Sure, there's nothing wrong with fighting. That's what you would expect secularists and Islamists to do. They don't have to get along, they don't have to agree, but as a basic starting point, they have to agree to work within the democratic process. I think it's problematic when you say, well, you don't like your opponents, so you're going to try to bring in the military and support a military intervention to depose that government, because then you're working outside of the system. And I think the challenge in Egypt was trying to come up with a set of rules of the game, a basic foundation that enough people were comfortable with, so they worked within that process instead of going outside of it. And I think where Morsi really did fail was not being able to convince liberals and other non-Islamists that they really had a stake in the system. And by virtue of his, I think, alienating approach, his stubborn attitude, his failure to govern inclusively, he pushed people outside of the system. Then they had the incentive to play spoiler. If you're not part of the system, then you want to bring it down, right? So I think that was one of his big mistakes. And I think the Constitution was a big part of that. And in retrospect, certainly they should have done things differently when it came to the Constitution drafting process to make sure that liberals weren't going to feel like this Constitution wasn't theirs or wasn't representative of them. But again, that's very difficult. How was he going to be able to convince them? But I think that he could have done more, made more of a good faith effort, and that wasn't really in the cards there. Now, Tunisia, I think, again, could be a relative bright spot. It has been so far. And I hope that with the next government that's formed after the elections, Islamists are likely to win. And I would hope that there can be some kind of power sharing, some kind of coalition government where secular parties are part of that coalition. Again, we'll have to wait and see. Again, it's very challenging because of this basic distrust that Islamists have towards secularists and secularists have towards Islamists, again, because they do actually believe in very different things. They do see society moving in a very different direction. So again, it's an open question, and I would hope that the international community supports the Tunisian transition, because that's really the one positive example that we have in the Arab world. If we take it Middle East more broadly, Turkey still holds out some hope, and even though it's moving in a more negative direction, it still is a relatively successful country by Middle Eastern standards.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ford, for
Thank you
speaking
so
to
much
us
for
this
having
evening.
me.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.